The Penny Press, a revolution in newsprint, created by Anita Heights. Since its advent in the 1830s, the penny press has revolutionized the look and feel of newspapers. It is credited with creating a new form of objective writing we now know as journalism. The penny press has defined what people consider to be news, gave the lower classes affordable print. It also gave the urban working classes something to read that they could identify with and at times take their mind off of their current hardships. Not only did the penny paper reach tens of thousands of urban citizens on a daily basis, it has also had a lasting impact on the structure and content of newspapers today. The penny press may have revolutionized journalism into its present recognizable form, but newspapers and journalists of sorts had been around for quite some time before the penny press came onto the scene in the 1830s. Many newspapers were distributed on a weekly or even daily basis to a narrowly targeted audience. Topics discussed in these newspapers were generally geared towards the upper classes and revolved around politics. These newspapers required a subscription and generally cost 6 cents an issue. Since the state of politics and the views of political parties do not change drastically, the stories in such papers were hardly considered late-breaking news. Likewise, there were daily commercial and mercantile sheets geared towards trade and goods that would be of interest to prominent citizens and business owners. These dailies also carried a price tag of 6 cents an issue. These topics had very little relevance to the lives of the average urban citizen, who was most likely a poor laborer or factory worker. Labor newspapers could arguably be a transition between traditional elitist newspapers and the penny press. These papers were often of more interest to factory workers. They would advertise jobs, deal with workers' issues, conditions, and reforms, as well as reporting on local news. The goal of the labor papers was to educate, inform, and instruct factory workers. Even though the language of these papers was more accessible to the lower classes, the hefty 6-cent price tag per issue made purchasing a paper on a daily basis unattainable for most workers. The ultimate goal of any newspaper is, and always has been, to communicate their message to their audience. When the penny press stepped onto the scene, the style and content of the message as well as the targeted audience was forever changed. Benjamin Day was the official founder of the penny press in 1833. Day never actually intended to be in the newspaper business at all and only published his first issue of The Sun in order to promote his publishing business. The first issue was anything but late-breaking news. Day literally cut stories and ads out of other newspapers that were already 2 or 3 days old. Rather than charging 6 cents an issue, Day set his prices competitively at a penny and sent newspaper boys to the street corners to sell these papers. This combination is likely what made Day an overnight success. Within the week, Day was no longer stealing stories and had hired his own writer. Within the month, his newspaper had its own logo and slogan, "The Sun, it shines for all." Initially, Day was selling 1,000 papers daily. Within the year, the total rose to 10,000, and by 1835, the Sun's readership had reached 15,000 daily. The price wasn't the only difference between traditional newspapers and the penny press. Size was also an important factor. Traditional newspapers were large sheets that required a table to be read. The penny press papers used much smaller pieces of paper, allowing readers to literally read their newspapers everywhere they wanted. With the success of The Sun, competition began to spring up. Day's biggest competition was James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald, established in 1835. Soon, these two newspaper moguls began trying to outscoop one another for the most outrageous and scandalous stories to attract readership. The content of these papers was also very different from traditional papers. Where traditional papers focused on politics and business, the penny press had a more of an entertainment undertone and appealed to a larger demographic. The tone of the paper was quite often more gossip-like, and the majority of news was crime and crisis-based. The penny press thrived on all things sensational. On a daily basis, stories were written about the happenings at the police station and the courts, reporting wild tales about friends and neighbors. Reporters would write follow-ups in subsequent issues to further interest readers and to drag out the drama. Perhaps the most famous sensationalized story printed in the penny press was the Moon Hoax of 1835. The Moon Hoax was a series of 6 articles published in The Sun, written by journalist Richard Adam Locke. These stories contain details of a new scientific study that was made in South America by an astronomer who found life on the moon in the form of man bats. While we may now shake our heads in amazement that anyone would believe this, many, if not most readers, didn't even question the authenticity of this article. This was the first ever hoax printed in the media, and it played on the love of sensationalism in the 19th century. Even when the moon hoax was discovered as a ruse, the majority of readers and even other newspapers praised Locke and the Sun for their creativity. Their thoughts about the story went along the lines of, well, if it's real then it's exciting, and if it isn't true then at least it was entertaining. Bennett did not react to the story the same way. He was outraged at the lies printed in the Sun and published his thoughts on the matter in his paper. Thus began discussions about what news was, who the audience was, and what the expectations around the reality in news was. Bennett argued that there was a delicate balance between the entertaining sensational stories and needing to uphold some sense of reality and truth. The moon hoax had tipped the balance in the wrong direction. While Bennett was quick to accuse Day of fraud with the moon hoax, he can also be seen as falling into the trap of printing lies in order to sell papers. Bennett knowingly defended the innocence of axe murderer Richard Robinson in his paper, who was responsible for murdering prostitute Helen Jewett. Bennett knew that Robinson was guilty and yet printed information claiming his innocence and pointing the fingers to the police cover-up. Bennett fashioned his tale in a way that he knew the middle classes, who Robinson was a part of, would like in order to gain their readership. In this he was successful. Printing stories of sensationalized murder and fictitious scientific discoveries is probably why editors of newspapers like The Sun and the New York Herald were accused of lowering journalistic standards, pandering to the lowest tastes, and reveling in the most lurid of stories. Yet readers kept buying papers. Not only were readers getting local and international news, but they were also being entertained. The writing in the penny press claimed to be objective, as reporters appeared to fairly represent everyone, yet there was little difference in the way that news stories and editorials were actually presented. The content of the penny press was certainly a product of its time. The penny press had tremendous influence over the general population, and therefore can be seen as reflecting the feelings of popular culture. Not all stories published in the penny press were outrageous. Christian sermons were also often published in these papers, reflecting the dominant culture of the time. Many discussions regarding slavery and women's rights were also included in the penny press. The penny press was certainly a product of its time and culture, but it's also had a lasting impact. The penny press has been credited with bringing investigative journalism to America. It is also credited with democratizing the press by sidestepping the control of the elite and opening up a whole new realm of information. The early publishers of the penny press were firm believers in equality. Everyone had the same right to access news and information. They believed that all citizens had the right to be informed of what was happening in the world, and they should be able to form their own opinions on these matters. The goal of the penny press was very much to give people the facts on which they could form their own opinion and remove power of knowledge from the wealthy and redistribute it to the lower classes. With its goal, the penny press blurred the lines of social status, giving more importance to the middle and working classes. By creating a new target audience, the penny press can be seen as an agent of social change as well as an agent of mass communication. The penny press also had an impact in helping define what news was, the difference between fact and fiction, and exactly where this line was to be drawn in terms of journalism. From stories like the moon hoax and the Helen Jewett murder, we can see that even though lines were blurred, expectations were being set up for what the journalistic standards were that reporters would have to follow. Newspapers kept each other accountable, quite often openly attacking one another in print when they believed the lines were crossed at the expense of duping readers. The penny press also forced traditional 6-cent newspapers to adapt to their model of journalism in order to retain their readership. Arguably, the penny press also had an impact on the expansion of literature. Contemporary writers such as Poe responded to some of the articles published in the penny press, noting that this new form of journalism had had an impact on fiction. The penny press certainly did provide a more educated middle and working class with more leisure time the opportunity to purchase inexpensive print. The penny press would not have been possible without exploiting newly available technologies. Prior to the 1830s, the hand crank press was used. This type of printing press allowed for 1,000 sheets of paper to be printed on a daily basis. When the speed or steam press was invented, it allowed newspapermen like Day and Bennett to be able to print up to 1,000 sheets per hour, making it possible to circulate 10,000 papers daily. Advances in paper production also helped the penny press. Using large rolls of paper rather than individual sheets helped expedite the printing process. To be profitable in later years, the reporters needed to scoop others' stories. To do this, they used boats to meet ships offshore as they were coming in from Europe. The Pony Express, train carrier pigeons, and later the telegraph were also used to source information for stories. Furthermore, trains, Pony Express, and boats were also used to distribute the newspapers out of the city. The penny press changed the look and feel of newspapers. By changing the content from political and business to human interest stories and sensationalized crimes, the audience shifted from elite to the commoners. These newspapers appeal to a much broader audience, simultaneously entertaining and informing. Perhaps the most notable contribution of the penny press to present-day journalism is the impact the penny press had on journalistic standards and defining what news was. This new type of newspaper had a more literate population and advances in technology to thank for its success.